This is lecture 11C. So last time I talked about the nature of the religion of Islam. Now I want to go back to sort of political events. So Muhammad initially he starts hearing the messages from Gabriel in 610, and for the first 12 years he was basically gathering a group of followers around him in Mecca. And these were initially people he was from his close friends and family, and then later it began to extend a little farther. But Muhammad was almost immediately started to come into conflict with the Umayyads because the Umayyads were, of course, the clan that controlled Mecca, and they made a great deal of money off of having this religious shrine around this black rock in Mecca. But some of Muhammad's earliest messages were there's only one God, and he doesn't live in that black rock. And so he began to basically debunk all the religious stuff around this black rock, and the Umayyads really didn't like him for that. And he began to really sort of disrupt things, and even attract people from other clans, which is really kind of disruptive. And so the Umayyads began to increasingly see Muhammad as a problem, as something that had to be dealt with. And so Muhammad himself was protected by his wealthy uncle, who was fairly influential. So the Umayyads didn't go after his uncle. I mean, didn't go after Muhammad directly. But a lot of Muhammad's followers were from smaller clans that weren't that well protected, and the Umayyads would often intimidate them, sometimes even attack or kill them. And so things got increasingly dicey for Muhammad's followers in Mecca. Well, in 622. Muhammad gets an offer from the city of Medina, which is about 200 miles north of Mecca. And the merchants, Medina was a thriving merchant community, and it had several different groups, including Christians and Jews and various Arab tribes, and they were having a hard time getting along. There's a lot of tension between the different groups. And in the Arab world, one of the standard ways you handle that is that you would find a religious man who was outside of any of the groups involved in the conflict, and you would bring him in and have him temporarily sort of take charge of the situation to mediate the disputes. So the merchant communities in Medina asked Muhammad to move to Medina and become a sort of religious arbiter for them. Well, Muhammad decides to take him up on it because Mecca is getting a little hot for him. And so in 622, Muhammad and his followers leave Mecca and move to Medina. This is called the Hijra. And once they get to Medina, Mecca starts converting more people, and he begins, because his followers are so devoted to him, he very quickly becomes essentially the ruler of Medina. And from that position as ruler of Medina, he decides he's going to actually go against Mecca. And so he begins to do things like attacking caravans that the Umayyads are defending, and trying to harass Mecca. And this leads to essentially a 10-year-long war between Mecca and Medina. Now, Mecca is wealthier and bigger than Medina, but Muhammad is sometimes just very lucky and sometimes a brilliant general. And so he wins more often than he loses, and he finally wins enough that he forces Mecca to come to the negotiating table. In particular, the Umayyads go to Muhammad. The Umayyads have been fighting against Muhammad for 10 years, but they go to Muhammad now and they say, what's it going to take for peace? And Muhammad basically lays out his terms that include a number of things, but one is that the Umayyads all have to convert to Islam. Okay? And so they do. They convert to Islam. And Muhammad then, in 632, he returns to Mecca, and he gives a famous speech on the plains of Abraham, just outside of plains of Arafat, rather, just outside of Mecca, and he lays out a couple of key precepts. One is that Islam is a universal religion; it should be told to everybody in the world. And second is that Muslims should never fight each other. Okay. But he also consecrates the Black Rock. The Black Rock now, he gets rid of all those shrines to all those other gods, and he actually says that the Black Rock has two indentations on top of it, which are the footprints of where Abraham stood when he was building a house for his wife and son, Ishmael, who is seen as the sort of founding figure of the father figure of Muslims. And so Muhammad says that Black Rock is sacred, not because there's a God in it, because there's not, but rather because this is the spot that Abraham had stood And Abraham, in the Judeo-Christian Muslim tradition, is seen as a major father figure, a sort of original ancestor. So Muhammad then elaborates the rituals of the pilgrimage that you're supposed to make every once in your lifetime to Mecca, and so the Kaaba, which is the building around the Black Rock, becomes the sort of center of Islam. It becomes the place in the Muslim world, the holiest place in the Muslim world, and that's the direction you pray to. So, but Muhammad had just barely defeated Mecca. And I should point out, during the course of his 10-year-long struggle with the Umayyads, Muhammad had built up a coalition of other tribes and clans in the Arabian Peninsula. Basically, there were a lot of people who hated the Umayyads and wanted to take them down a notch or two, and they joined Muhammad. Some of them converted to Islam, some of them didn't. But Muhammad had this coalition, and so when he conquers Mecca, he basically is now the ruler of about 2/3 of the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, but soon after conquering Mecca, or winning the struggle against Mecca, Muhammad dies in 632. And so this is a crisis for the Muslim community, because Muhammad was a messenger from God. He was getting messages directly from God. But Muhammad had also made it clear that he was what he called the seal of the prophets, the wax seal, not the animal, that he was the closure on the line of prophets that God had spoken to. He was the last one. God would speak no more to humanity. And so this raises the question, who should lead the community after Muhammad's gone, right? Well, a number of the top Muslims, the people who had been with Muhammad the longest, got together, and they came up with the idea of naming a caliph. And a caliph it means deputy, and it just means that he's going to be the person who is the head of the community now that Muhammad is gone. Now, caliph was an interesting idea because it was clearly a religious position in the sense that the community was defined by their religion. We're talking about the community of Muslims here. And the caliph is supposed to be sort of protecting the religion and keeping the community wholesome and whole and righteous and pure and moral. But the caliph was not expected to be a religious person in the sense of a theologian or a religious scholar or the person who knew the most about the religion or even somebody who spoke to God or anything like that. The caliph was clearly seen as the sort of corollary to the head of a clan or a tribe, somebody the community saw as their natural leader. So the caliph was basically a political leader, but there were strong religious overtones to this, right? The caliph was seen as preserving a religious community, although he wasn't a religious person himself. Well, the first 4 caliphs were chosen from very close friends and relatives of Muhammad. The people who had been with him the longest and were seen as the most holy and the most devout Muslims. And they had been with him through the whole fight, before, but with the Umayyads before 622, before leaving Mecca, and then through the whole fight after leaving Mecca. And so the first 4 caliphs are called by Muslims the rightly guided caliphs because they were seen as devout Muslims. And in fact, they lived out of tents, and they were kind of humble, and they didn't have all the trappings of big political leaders, and they didn't have big palaces or anything like that. They seemed to be genuinely devoutly Muslims who wanted to spread Islam. But after the death of the 4th caliph in 661, you see basically the next person who seizes the caliphate is an Umayyad. And now there had been one of the rightly guided caliphs was an Umayyad also, but Muawiyah is an Umayyad who seizes the caliphate, and he turns it into a dynasty. And so essentially he passes it on to his son, who passes it on to his son, etc. And so the Umayyads would rule the Muslim world as caliph from 661 to 750. The last Umayyad caliph dies in 750. They would actually be toppled in 749, 750 by a revolt against the Umayyads. And I'll talk about that a little bit. But basically, a revolt amongst Muslims, really beginning in Mesopotamia and Persia, begins in 749, and they name a new caliph. And then the last Umayyad and the first Abbasid go to war, and the Abbasids finally winning in 750, and the Abbasids would rule the Muslim world from 749, 750 until 1258, when the Mongols would destroy their empire. So let me turn then to the growth of this Muslim empire, right? That first the Muslim empire is under the four rightly guided caliphs, or it's under Muhammad, then it's under the four rightly guided caliphs, then it's under the Umayyads, and then it's under the Abbasids. But there's a continuous process of growth here. It's the same empire, okay? So under Muhammad, at Muhammad's death, Muslims controlled about 2/3 of the Arabian Peninsula. And when Muhammad died, his coalition actually started to fall apart. Remember, a lot of these clans and tribes had joined Muhammad's coalition not because they were Muslim, but because they wanted to fight against the Umayyads. So a lot of them just said, oh, well, the Umayyads are defeated now, we're going to go our own way. And so Muhammad, as soon as he died, his coalition started to fall apart because a lot of people said, well, my oath, my alliance was to Muhammad, and he's gone now, so we're out of here. So the first task of the four rightly guided caliphs was simply to reconquer the Arabian Peninsula, to sort of put back together this broken alliance through conquest, basically. And then they began to expand. They began to send feelers out into Egypt, out into Syria, etc. And they began to find, as I talked about with the Byzantines, they began to find that because the Byzantines and Sassanids were so exhausted from 100 years of warfare, it was fairly easy for Muslim armies to come pushing into these places and conquer them fairly quickly. The Byzantine armies often had low morale and were badly supplied, and they sort of collapsed. And if they got defeated in one battle, there was no backup plan. The Byzantines simply didn't have anything left. And so the Arabs conquered Egypt very quickly. They conquered Syria, and then they began to push into the Sassanid Empire, and they very quickly conquered Mesopotamia. But then they kept going, and they kept pushing, and the Sassanid Empire basically just collapsed. And the Muslim armies very quickly found they could push all the way across into India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India. And they could push up into Central Asia in modern day terms, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, etc. They also began to push in the other directions, though. They took Egypt, but then they kept going. They kept pushing across North Africa. And when they pushed across North Africa, they took what we would call Libya and Tunisia and then Algeria and Morocco. And then they crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and they invaded Spain in 711. And they conquered most of Spain over the next 15, 20 years. And they even began to push into southern France. And they were finally stopped by Charles Martel, who was a French nobleman at the Battle of Tours, Poitiers. In 732, and so then they got pushed back out of France. But they also began to push into Anatolia, and I talked about this with the Byzantines. They pushed into Anatolia, besieged Constantinople in 717, 718, and essentially they got pushed back, but they kept a chunk of Anatolia, a small chunk of Anatolia. So if you look at and most of this, by the way, had happened by 750. By the end of the Umayyad Caliphate, the Muslim world stretched it included Spain and then all of North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, across to Egypt. It included the entire Middle East, except Anatolia, which was still in the hands of the Byzantines for the most part. And then it extended through Mesopotamia, Persia, all the way over to northern India, and it extended up into into Central Asia a ways. And so that then was the empire that the Abbasids took over and ruled, for another 500 years. And I'll talk in the last part of this lecture. There's actually a part D to this lecture. I'm going to talk about what that Muslim world was like. But it's really an astonishing growth if you think about how fast they spread out, how big an empire they covered, because they conquered essentially everything Alexander the Great had, plus North Africa and Spain and the Arabian Peninsula. and they did it. Well, actually, they didn't have Anatolia or Greece, but they did it in just about 100 years. So that's the growth of the Muslim empire, first under the four rightly guided caliphs, the Umayyads, and then the Abbasids. And so now I want to talk about Muslim society just a little bit.